When two polar bears showed up at an abandoned house, the residents of a tiny distant town asked for assistance right away. These were apex predators, out of place and maybe lethal, not typical visits. Scientist David Chish was the first to respond. He was tasked with figuring out why the polar bears had arrived at this house and why they now refused to leave. What David discovered would leave the entire village stunned. It would take courage, clever thinking, and teamwork to uncover the truth and solve the problem. Little did anyone know that the answers would be both heartwarming and heartbreaking. For David, this wasn't just a wildlife incident. It was a riddle, an enigma with an unexpected turn that he had to solve. To ensure you won't miss any of our amazing new stories before we begin the story, hit the like button, sign up for our channel, and click the notification bell. Up until the day the polar bears showed up, the residents of the little settlement led peaceful lives. Nestled in a remote area surrounded by wilderness, the village was the kind of place where unusual things rarely happened. The people were therefore plunged into chaos when the two huge creatures arrived. None of the locals had ever seen anything like what they were presently viewing. Hence, they knew nothing about what to do. Such an occurrence was the first one of its kind. No one had ever seen polar bears in the region before, and their sudden appearance sparked panic. The bears had wandered into one of the village's old abandoned houses, and they refused to leave. It was more about the way the bears stayed in the house, and not just the fact that they were there. It seemed like they had a purpose for being there. The house was at the edge of the village, but its proximity to nearby homes was enough to cause fear. Families who lived nearby packed their belongings and sought refuge with friends and relatives farther away. The tension in the village was high, people were scared, and it was quite understandable. The locals knew they had to call for help, as none of them knew what they should or could do. The villagers were desperate for answers and help. The first to arrive on the scene was David Chish, a scientist. David was tasked with figuring out why the animals suddenly showed up in the village, what had drawn them to the abandoned house, and why they had decided not to leave. He knew it was no coincidence that the polar bears were in the house at this time. When David reached the village, it was immediately clear which house the bears had claimed. A small group had assembled at a safe distance while the residents had cautiously taped off the area. David made his way into the house. David's legs were shaking as he made his way through the abandoned house. It was pitch black almost, and the only light he had was the small torch on his phone. He knew that the two polar bears were still around here somewhere. He just hoped that they were asleep. As he was walking around, he did not notice anything out of the ordinary, nothing that could have possibly attracted these two polar bears to the house. But then, David made his way to the bedroom, and when he opened up the door, it all quickly became very clear to him. The two polar bears were lying soon asleep here, and in between them was what had attracted them to this house. He knew he had to proceed carefully. Being apex predators, polar bears' behavior can be erratic, particularly in foreign habitats. David could have never expected to find this here. But how did these polar bears end up here? What had attracted them to the house? And why was David so adamant about finding out? The people of the small village had gotten the shock of their lives when the two polar bears suddenly showed up. It was the first time something like this had ever happened in their remote town. No one had seen where the bears had come from, and no one dared approach the animals. The situation was utterly baffling and terrifying. The only thing that they knew was that the animals had found their way into one of the old abandoned houses. The abandoned house the bears had chosen was at the edge of the village, and the people living nearby wasted no time in packing up their belongings and staying with friends farther away. The villagers knew the bears being there was too risky. They didn't know what the bears were capable of, and none of them were willing to find out. Somebody had to get the animals out of the house. But even more pressing was the need to understand why they had come in the first place. For the villagers, it was an unsettling mystery. It was well known that the village was fairly difficult to reach. It would take special animal handlers a couple of days at least to get everything they needed to the location. But who was able to show up much sooner than everyone else was a scientist named David, who was a specialist in wild animals, so he could be really helpful in this kind of situation. When David first heard about the polar bears being so far from their natural habitat, he was intrigued. As a specialist in wild animals, cases like this were his expertise. Polar bears in a village? David couldn't get his head around it. It made no sense. He knew he had to go see it for myself. The trip to the village was grueling, a 10-hour drive through rugged terrain. The drive felt like an eternity. But David didn't hesitate. He left early the next morning, fueled by curiosity and a determination to help. He kept running various scenarios in his head, trying to prepare himself for what he might find. On the way, David made calls to his colleagues, brainstorming possible reasons for the bear's presence and setting up a plan of action. His colleagues were also as baffled as he was. It just wasn't something any one of them had come across before. By the time he reached the village, he had a working theory, but he knew he wouldn't be sure of anything until he saw the situation with his own eyes. Even if he was all alone, he wanted to know the reason why these animals were there. He was worried that it was going to be really difficult, but as it would turn out, that would go relatively easy. When David arrived at the village, it was immediately clear which house the bears had claimed. The first thing he noticed was the caution tape the villagers had set up around the house, and a small crowd had gathered at a safe distance. The polar bears themselves were his second observation. Resting on the porch and in front of the window, the two polar bears were there with their white fur shining in the sunlight. Their enormous white bodies stood out sharply against the worn-out wood of the abandoned structure. David had never really seen a polar bear up close before. They were breathtaking, even majestic. But David couldn't forget how dangerous they could be. Seeing those in person was surreal. They were beautiful yet intimidating. David's excitement was quickly tempered by fear. He wanted nothing more than to get inside the house and figure out what had drawn the animals there. But he also knew that entering the house would be risky. David's first task was to figure out how the polar bears had ended up in the village. Polar bears are native to Arctic regions, thousands of miles away. Their presence here made no sense. Being apex predators, polar bears can have erratic behavior, particularly in foreign habitats. David understood he had to keep his watch on since one mistake may endanger everyone else. This wasn't just about the bears, it was also about keeping the villagers safe too. David began by ruling out the obvious possibilities. He looked about to see whether the region had any zoos or animal sanctuaries, but there were none. He also investigated the possibility of private ownership, anyone who might have been keeping these bears illegally. But no one in the region had reported missing animals. Every possibility seemed less likely than the last. Every lead David followed came up empty. It felt like chasing shadows. It was like the bears had appeared out of thin air. Next, David turned to the villagers for information. Some claimed to have seen polar bears in the surrounding forests in years past, though these sightings were rare and unconfirmed. One villager swore he'd seen a polar bear while hunting a decade ago. At the time, no one believed him. Now it didn't seem so impossible. Others dismissed the idea as impossible, attributing the bear's presence to human involvement. David found himself torn between skepticism and curiosity. It was frustrating to David. The more David learned, the less he felt he understood. The villagers were no help. All he got from them were vague accounts. They had their theories, but none of them provided concrete answers. David knew he couldn't act alone. He needed help to safely investigate the house and uncover the reason for the bear's presence. Working with the villagers, David devised a plan. The goal was to tire out the bears, making it safer for David to enter the house. The villagers took turns making noise near the house to prevent the bears from resting deeply. It wasn't a perfect plan, David knew that, but it was the best option we had. Even though it was risky, it was the only way to get inside the house without provoking the bears. The villagers set up a rotation system, ensuring that no one was left alone near the house. Safety measures were put in place, including having a car ready to whisk the noisemakers away if the bears became aggressive. The villagers were incredibly brave. They understood the risks, but they also knew this was the only way to protect their community. After days of effort, David's opportunity finally came. The bears had fallen into a deep sleep, and David seized his chance and carefully made his way into the house. Inside was cool, calm air that smelt faintly of wet wood. David's footsteps echoed as he proceeded gingerly from room to room, his torch creating lengthy shadows on the walls. Every creak of the floorboards made his heart race, David said. He couldn't shake the feeling that the bears might wake up at any moment. David was hyper-aware of every sound and every moment. David recognized at this time that he had to keep the people safe, not only about the bears, but also about avoiding any unwarranted dangers. David paused in the doorway, his torch beam quivering slightly to light the space. His heart hammering in his chest, he momentarily forgot to breathe. Though he had readied himself for several possibilities, he was not ready for what he found. When David reached the bedroom, he found the polar bears curled up on the floor. The two polar bears lay curled on the dusty floor, their massive forms rising and falling gently with each breath. They looked peaceful, almost serene, but their sheer size was a reminder of their immense power. Between them, nestled against the mother, lay the reason for their stubborn presence, a small polar bear cub. Its fur was impossibly white, blending seamlessly with its mother's. I looked so small that it was hard to believe it belonged to such powerful creatures. The sight was both beautiful and heartbreaking for David to behold. David's heart ached as he watched the mother bear shift slightly, pulling the cub closer with a protective paw. This was a family, desperately trying to stay together. That's when it all clicked. These bears weren't by chance, and they were here to protect their young. The mother bear had likely chosen the abandoned house as a safe place to give birth. It was clear that she saw the house as a sanctuary, and all she was trying to do was to protect her baby. The sight filled David with a mix of awe and dread. As much as David wanted to stay and observe, he knew he couldn't linger. The bears were wild creatures, hence their response to his presence may have been erratic. He sensed the importance of the matter, even if he was seeing something rather remarkable. Not for the protection of the town or for their own, these creatures could not remain here. With the truth uncovered, animal rescue services were called in to relocate the bears. The process was delicate, requiring sedation to ensure the safety of both the animals and the rescue team. The bears were sent to a sizable zoo where they would be cared for and kept safe. Although that was not the result David had hoped for, it was the best they could have done given the conditions. Although many of the residents felt a sense of loss, the fact that their houses were returned, however, relieved them. The bears had become a strange part of the villagers' lives. It's hard to explain, but the villagers started to miss them when they were gone. The abandoned house remains untouched to this day, a quiet reminder of the extraordinary event that once unfolded there. Over time, it has become overgrown with vines and moss, slowly being reclaimed by nature. David's experience with the polar bears left a lasting impact on him. It was a humbling reminder of the bond that exists between humans and nature for David. The bears showed him that even the wildest creatures have reasons for all they do. David continues to work as a wildlife specialist, using his knowledge to protect and preserve the natural world. Every case is unique, but this one will always hold a special place in David's heart.